Chapter 5, Social Interaction, Social Structure, and Groups. This chapter, we're going to cover quite a bit. These 4 modules, social interaction and social structure, and what that means, social structure in the global perspective, and why that's important to understand. And then we're going to focus on one of these elements of the social structure, which is groups, and we're going to understand groups, and as groups get very, very large, how we understand organizations. What determines a person's status in society in our look ahead? How do our social roles affect our social interactions? I think I've mentioned before that we occupy we occupy a status in society, and in that status we play a role. And what is that role? And I'm gonna give you some practice on how to think about your own status. Various statuses. We often call that a status set. And what is your status set, and the different roles that you play. What is the place of social institutions as well, such as the family as a social institution, religion, the government, the various others, the media. How do these, what is the place of these institutions in our social structure, and how can we better understand an element of the social structure, which is groups, and manage these large groups, these large organizations. The first module is social interaction and social structure. Now, before we talk about status, and I want to go over these 2 concepts. And these 2 concepts are central to sociology, which is our social interaction and social structure. We use the term social interaction to refer to the ways in which people respond to one another. And social structure refers to the way a society is organized into predictable relationships. And these 2 concepts, they work together and are closely related to the socialization process, which we just discussed in Chapter 4. So each of our social reality is literally constructed from our social interactions. Reality is shaped by perceptions, evaluations, and definitions. And according to sociologists by the name of Herbert Blumer, our response to someone's behavior is based on the meaning that we attach to his or her actions. So what constitutes reality varies, and it will vary across culture. So again, social interaction is that way we respond to one another, whether it's face-to-face, over the telephone, FaceTime, the computer. We're learning through social distancing how to use our computers more to still socially interact, even in times of social distancing. And the meanings we attach to people's behavior become shaped by these interactions with them and with the larger society. All these interactions take place within a social structure. So depending on the institution, whether it's within our family, how do we interact with our family members compared to how do we interact with our teachers? Think about the different ways you interact with maybe your teacher. It might be different than you interact with your parents, with your children, with your friends, those different things. And our social reality is literally constructed from these social interactions. So I'm going to give you an example. Bumping into someone, either on accident or on purpose. Now, a long time ago, I brought my sons to a Halloween party at school, and my children were very young. I think my oldest son was in 1st or 2nd grade at the time, and he was just there. All the children were dressed in Halloween costumes, and so they were getting really excited seeing, recognizing their friends. All the children were recognizing their friends in these costumes, and so my son is there dressed, I think he was Spider-Man that year, and he's dressed as Spider-Man, and he had his mask on, but a friend knew how much he loved Spider-Man, so when he recognized my son, he came running up to him, tapped him, probably a little hard on the shoulder, saying, "Hey, Blaze, hi, I see you," and he just kept going. My son reacted to that, and he said, "Hey, he just hit me." Now, his reaction to that interaction was that this young boy hit him. when in actuality, the young boy was just very excited to have recognized my son as a friend, and he knew who he was in the costume, and he, exuberantly came by and tapped him on the shoulder. Had I not been there to observe that interaction, what do you think might have happened? All right, so you got to, think about what is our interpretation of what that interaction might be, and then how we then in turn react to that. So as Herbert Bloomer said, our response to someone's behavior is based on the meaning that we attach to that person's actions, to his or her actions. And so sometimes thinking about things this way helps us stop and think about, what really did happen? What was the person's intention? And did we misinterpret their intention? Which my son actually did at that point. And I was able to intervene. Had I not been there to see the interaction, it might have turned out pretty bad. So again, reality is shaped by our perceptions, evaluations, and definitions. The nature of social interaction and what constitutes that reality varies from culture to culture. Again, people in different cultures interact and react differently. So for example, in Western cultures, couples see marriage as not as a relationship and a social status. In Japan, though, marriage is considered more of a social status. Once you're married, it creates that social status for you in society. The ability to define social reality reflects a group's power within society. So it's an important aspect of process of social change, and it involves our redefining or reconstructing that social reality. So another example, your book further illustrates how we define these social realities by considering, again, the popularity of tattoos. There was a time when tattoos were associated with a certain group or counterculture. Punk rockers, I remember, growing up near South Street in Philadelphia, punk rockers, biker groups, gang members, anyone who wore a tattoo, you connect that social reality, because that is what I experienced with people with tattoos. As I've gotten older and matured and have been around more and more people in the general, as this is increased in popularity in the general population, more mothers are going out to get tattoos to represent their having a child. And so more and more people are getting, and in the popular culture are getting tattoos. So the social reality needs to be redefined and reconstructed. So now with an increased popularity, more mainstream social interactions with people, tattooed people, the perception has to change, and that has changed. And so for so many, it's just a rite of passage. And my husband, who has quite a few tattoos, interacts with others who sees, wow, that's pretty cool ink. And, you start to really, it gives that shared meaning. And what is that meaning to that person who got that tattoo? So the more we interact with people who have tattoos, the more our perceptions change. That's the idea. Again, and how these social interactions will vary from culture to culture. Again, public displays of affection in marriage, that would be quite different in Japan, where marriage is considered a more of a social status. You would never show outwardly visible displays of affection. Where in Western cultures, in the United States in particular, people will walk hand in hand, side by side, instead of a woman walking 5 steps behind the man. So again, it depends on the culture. Now, typically at this point in my lecture, I would show the Stanford Prison Experiment and illustrate how social structure influences our behavior, a person's behavior. So how our social interactions take place within a social structure. So whether it be in your home and within your family institute, your family group, at school, at work, in this case, in a prison. How does a prison environment define a person's situation? And the group in power typically is the one that defines the social reality for the individuals that are in that particular social structure. So that's why I show it here, and then we really, can literally talk about this throughout this chapter, but then also again in the next chapter on deviance. And just so as an example, to illustrate further, sociologist William I. Thomas referred to what he called this definition of the situation that could actually influence a person's, an individual's thinking and their personality. People respond not only to the other person, but the meaning that person or situation has for them. So here in Philip Zimbardo's mock prison experiment, where prisoners and guards accepted their definition of the situation, because if you once you watch the video, I think it's about a half an hour, 29 minutes, I believe. Very worthwhile. It's a shortened version of the original documentary, but when you see this illustration, you see that these college students are, in fact, randomly assigned to either being a prisoner or a prison guard. So, no matter, randomly were selected so that they could have gone either way. And so, once they're assigned that power as a prison guard, you'll see how they internalize that power that over the prisoners, and then also in turn how those prisoners accept their fate in the situation. Another reason I would like you to take a look at this experiment, this video, is within this short documentary I've posted here for you, and that I've put the link online in Canvas, is that within it is is Milgram's experiment, the electric shock experiment, to help us understand how many people do obey authority and people with power. So in that case, in Milgram's experiment, it's a person in a lab coat, doctors. We defer to their opinions. We defer to teachers and lawyers and judges and people who have, we assume have power in society. And in Stanford Prison Experiment, we see how that happens with prison guards. So the group in power is generally the ones that have ability to find that social reality within society. And so this becomes an important concept to understand as we move forward into the inequality that exists within society. When we get to gender and race and ethnicity and so forth, and social class. The next thing I want to talk about are the elements of social structure. Now that we know all social interactions occur within a social structure, we're going to talk about the 5 elements that make up the social structure. And these elements develop over your lifetime. So over a person's lifetime, through the socialization process, we see these 5 elements developing. The first is status. Second is social roles. The third is groups, which we will expand on later in this chapter, but we'll briefly cover it here. Social institutions and social networks. So first, statuses. Status is a socially defined position within a large group or society, ranging from lowest to highest. Now, examples include such things as teacher, student, son or daughter, president, janitor, prison guard, as you see, your neighbor, parent. A number of statuses can be held at the same time, and we call that a status set. It's not just a way to say, someone's distinguished. Those who are wealthy have power, for instance, and have influence. There are a number of different statuses that we can hold within, at the same time. Now, sociologists make references to 3 types of status, and we'll go over those next. The first 2 are ascribed and achieved status. The third is master status, which we'll get to. But first, we'll go over ascribed status. And these are important to think about, and I want you to practice this a little bit. And I'm going to put a handout on Canvas for you to practice it next week. So an ascribed status is assigned to a person by society without regard for the person's unique talents or characteristics. So in other words, this is something that's generally assigned to us at birth. It's something, we can't do anything about. It's biological. It's not chosen. It's involuntary. So examples are our race, our ethnicity, our gender, our age. Now, a social class I would include here as well, because you're born into the social class of your family. Now, that later can become an achieved status because you can, through your hard work and unique talents, can move up the social class ladder. But initially, it is a ascribed status because you're born into that social class. But generally, so that's something that you can eventually do something. But typically, the ascribed statuses we refer to are those that we cannot change: our race, our gender, our age. And it's significant because of the social meanings behind these different statuses. Again, these are things that are involuntary. They're biological. They're not chosen. They're inborn. The second is the achieved status. So this status is one we earn. It comes through our own efforts, our talents, and our work. So for example, a doctor, a prison guard, a tennis player, a dance instructor, a social worker, a lawyer, computer programmer. We do something to obtain an achieved status. Now, because we hold more than one status at the same time, certain statuses are viewed as more important than others, and that's where we sort of see where they fall in the range of these different statuses. These are very complex. Ascribed statuses often influence our achieved status. If you think about it, whether you're male or female, it might drive you into a different achieved status. I know, for example, I went to an all-girls high school, and in many cases, I would talk to a guidance counselor saying what, I wanted to be a math teacher when I, grew up. And I was always deterred from that. I was like, well, why don't you be, go into, the social sciences? Why don't you become an English teacher or a social studies teacher? Something that was more in the social science arena, and instead of math and science, which was geared towards males. So again, it often can influence that achieved status. I didn't let that deter me, but in fact, I became the first class I ever taught was a statistics class. So you've got to remember that sometimes you've got to still go against what common opinion is of you, and that ascribed status will influence that. Maybe it's something that you consider when you do apply for a job, and it is an occupation where the organization is primarily run by males or females, or people of a particular race that are prejudiced or discriminatory, and so that will then deter you from wanting to work in an organization like that. So those are some examples. Now, your status ascribed or achieved can be positive or negative. So you've got to, again, consider that as well. And some statuses can be either achieved or ascribed. Religion is another one. Often we're born into the religion of our family members, but later in our lives we may change religions, and so that is an achieved in terms of what we need to learn through our own efforts to achieve that status. So again, and it can be used in a positive or a negative in terms of what we do achieve in our lives. If we do work hard use our efforts, we can achieve a high status in terms of our social class. If we don't, maybe those efforts might be viewed as in more of a negative light. If we don't, we end up homeless or something like that. So again, it doesn't mean that it's something that you blame the victim, but society in general might influence what that status might be. Now, as I mentioned, so here is an example of the many statuses that we hold, and they're divided in terms of the yellow are ascribed statuses for this young woman, and the blue are the achieved statuses. So this is an example I'd like you to take a look at. Female, her gender, her age. Age is something we have no control over, so it becomes our ascribed status, and so whatever your age is, and that will, again vary over time. The fact that you are a daughter or a son, and this young woman's Latina, so again, that becomes an ascribed status when we label it. The fact that she's a sister, again, she has no control over that. And here, her religion. Now, if she changes religion, we would maybe move that into her achieved status, but you're born into the religion of your family. Same thing with your social class. But your achieved statuses are things like, being a classmate, you have to work at that. Being a student, being a roommate takes work. Being a marital partner, a friend, an employee. So when I post the handout, you'll see it looks very much like this. There are circles, and you want to fill in certain circles with you in the center, and then illustrate the many statuses that you hold. And then I'd like to, the last thing I want, the third status is your master status. Because we hold more than one status at the same time, that certain statuses become viewed as being more important. They can be, in turn, labeled our master status. So if you could think about these statuses, which one might be considered your master status? Maybe this young woman is a doctor and she's married, and she's a sister and a daughter and all of these things, but the fact that she's female might be her master status, because that's the the one thing that kind of overrides all those other statuses. Or maybe the fact that she's a doctor is the master status. People know her and consider, the fact that she's a doctor becomes that master status for her. Again, this is something that could change over time. Maybe, if we take an example of someone who is an athlete, but they become injured or get a disability, sometimes that disability becomes the master status. So let's consider that definition. So this master status I've mentioned is a status that dominates other statuses and determines our general position in society. So in the United States, again, the ascribed status of race and gender can often function as our master status. So it doesn't matter if we're, a doctor, a lawyer, a great athlete. It is oftentimes our race or our gender that stands out most as our master status. Many people find that status as being disabled gets a lot of weight. The first thing people see is, if a person's in a wheelchair or is blind, or, that's the first thing. It becomes, oh, that blind doctor, or, something along those lines. So it's sociologist Everett Hughes who calls a master status one that dominates others and determines a person's general position in society. And I have another example here, if this is still in your textbook. Arthur Ashe. I don't know if anybody remembers who Arthur Ashe was. He's a great tennis player. One of the first African American tennis players who achieved greatness. However, he contracted AIDS, the AIDS virus, and he ultimately died of that disease. And so that became his master status. So no matter that he was the first African American great tennis player, and the fact that he played tennis so well, those master statuses kind of went by the wayside once he contracted the AIDS virus. Okay, now I'd like to turn to the second element of the social structure, which are our social roles. Now, social roles are a set of expectations for people who occupy a given social position or that status. So again, we occupy a status and we play a role. Police, for example, are supposed to protect us. Doctors are supposed to help us when we are hurt or sick. Prison guards, prisoners. We expect that the people in these particular social roles, social positions, social statuses learn the skills to take on those roles. So again, our expectations might vary. You know, doctors who specialize as opposed to doctors who are just general practitioners. You know, if we break a bone, break an arm, break a leg, we go to an orthopedic doctor, someone who's more specialized in that area than just our general family doctor. So we expect more or less from individuals based on their social roles. Now, something like role conflict can occur when incompatible expectations arise from two or more social positions held by the same person. So when a person gets promoted but maintains a relationship with their former coworkers, for example, all of a sudden, you know, there's a shift in what those roles are. And this also occurs when someone moves into an occupation that is not typical of their ascribed status. An example of this would be, you know, a female police or fire police officer or fire person, a male preschool teacher. You know, we don't typically see, you know, we see mostly women in that particular occupation. But if a male is a preschool teacher, maybe male nurses, more and more men become nurses. Or females become weightlifters, we start to see, you know, a shift. So roles of one status may conflict with roles of another status, and that conflict can occur when individuals move into occupations that are not common among people with their ascribed status. The role strain refers to the difficulties that arise when the same social position imposes conflicting demands and expectations. When parents attempt to be an authoritative figure to their children and also want to be their children's friend. Or another example is a senior citizen who needs assistance and must accept help from, you know, maybe their children. It's sort of a difficulty, a strain that occurs in that relationship. Because, you know, the parent is usually the one who's parenting the child, not the other way around. And also the Navajo Nation police, you know, they're very peacekeeping people, yet they're in a police role, and they must uphold the law. And definitely also people who belong to minority culture can experience a strain while working in the mainstream culture, that double consciousness that W.E. Du Bois referred to. And here's an illustration of what, you know, role conflict versus role strain. I like to illustrate this and show this in class and have you think about, you know, these two diagrams. The first is the role conflict, where you occupy these different statuses and roles. You know, you're a son or a daughter, and the role you play. Maybe mom's sick and in the hospital, and you should visit her. But you're also a friend, and your friend's having a birthday party, and you've been invited. But you're also a student, and you have a test tomorrow, and so you need to prepare for the exam. And you're an employee as well, so you hold this as your status set. And as a worker, you know, your employer asked you to come in for some emergency overtime. So what do? This is a conflict, and you need to really evaluate these different situations. And so that is a role conflict many people find themselves in. The other diagram illustrates you as a student and what that role strain might look like. You do well in your classes, but at the same time, you don't want to, you know, brag about it. You don't want, you know, to make your fellow classmates look bad. So you may not, you know, brag about the score you got on your exam in order to make your other, you know, classmates not feel bad. Another concept within our social roles is something called role exit. This was developed by a sociologist by the name of Helen Rose Fuchs Ebow. And this is the opposite of anticipatory socialization, if you recall that concept we mentioned in Chapter 4, where we prepare for a particular role. So this is the opposite of that. And this is the disengagement from a role that is central to one's identity to establish a new role. So here Ebow's illustrating her 4 stages of the role exit. And the first is doubt, this feeling of uncertainty in the current role, frustration. And I'll I'll use, an occupation, and maybe you're in a job, maybe you're a teacher, and you're having doubts, you're feeling burned out, and you're not sure you want to be a teacher anymore, and you want to examine, see what other options there are for you. So you search, in the second stage, you start to search for alternatives. What other occupations might interest you? Maybe you take a leave of absence from your teaching job. Oh, and here's another example we can use. A couple who is having doubts about their marital relationship. So they're doubting that in the first stage, and in the second stage, maybe they decide to separate in the search for alternatives. Maybe you go back to school. If you're looking for a new job, you try to learn a new skill. You may move out on your spouse and see if you can live separately for a while. The third stage is the action stage, or the departure stage, and this is a turning point in this role exit model. And so you're either going to quit your former job and take on this new occupation that you've learned a new skill for in school, and you found a new job. If your marriage is, you finally realize that, hey, we're not, this isn't working out. I prefer to, we get along better if we're separated. Maybe we should move ahead and get a divorce. Or in turn, maybe, you find that, so it becomes this turning point. Maybe you find that you're going to try to work things out. And so you really may take action at this stage. And then becomes the creation of a new identity. Now you're no longer a teacher, you're a computer programmer, because that's really where you found your passion. And so maybe you decided to get that divorce, and now you're a single person, and that's your new identity. And now you're embarking on the single life again. So that is an example of how role exit transpires. All right, the third element of the social structure in which much of our social interactions take place is within groups. Groups are very influential in our lives. They play a vital part in society's social structure. And there are any number of people who share similar norms, values, and expectations, and who interact on a regular basis. So much of our social interaction occurs in groups, whether it be two people, a couple, a dyad, a triad. The more people we add, we have names for all, how large these groups can become. But they could be your family, your peer group. The expectations of our social roles become clearly defined in the context of a group. So, for example, if you're a son or a daughter, what's expected of you as a son or daughter in relation to your parents, and vice versa as a parent in relation to your children. Again, within your peer group. Maybe it's a sports team. You're a member of a group of athletes. Somebody might be the captain in that group, or rises to that level of a captain. So those roles become very apparent in that group. The business office, who runs the meetings. A book club even has, certain people that become, who to do the refreshments, who select the book, who runs the discussion. All of these types of things are examples of groups. And groups, again, can be very influential, and that's why I've listed here. Our social roles become clearly defined in these groups, and we conform to some of these groups. We go along to our peers. We follow along. So if you watch this very short video, Conformity in the Waiting Room, I posted the link in Canvas. It illustrates how much the group can influence us. We kind of want to fit in. We don't want to be the outcast that's not going along with the group. Even if it's just a group of people sitting in a waiting room, which is another. There's an aggregate, and there's also other names for these types of groups. But anyway, Ash's conformity experiment is another really profound example of where power might come within a group. And it's a classic experiment. It's a little bit older. It's a little bit dated, but it really illustrates how there's those lines and who. Somebody starts saying the wrong answer to a question, and it's the wrong answer, but everyone's giving the wrong answer, and you don't want to be the only one that doesn't go along with the group, so you start giving the wrong answer as well. And so that's Asch's conformity experiment. If you want to take a moment to look, it's a little bit longer than the other one, but conformity in the waiting room is actually pretty funny. So I recommend that one. And the classic one is good to know, is again for future purposes. We will talk more about groups towards the end of this chapter. Social institutions are the fourth element of the social structure, and by examining the social institutions we have in society, we can understand better the structure of society. Social institutions are organized patterns of beliefs and behaviors centered on a basic social need, such as replacing personnel. We call it, that's the family. We belong to a family. As babies are born, we're increasing personnel. As older people, die off in the family. So family replaces these people. The government preserves social order in society. So we see the media. These are other examples of social institutions, and they all play parts, function in society. The government, the economy, healthcare system, religion. These are all examples of social institutions, and some of them we're going to spend a little time going over in future chapters. So a functionalist view of social institutions is that these social institutions fulfill 5 major functions or tasks to ensure that a society survives. So these 5 major tasks or functional prerequisites. These were identified by anthropologist David Aberle and sociologist Raymond Mack and Calvin Bradford. The first is the replacing of personnel, as we just mentioned. So this is either through reproduction, having babies, immigration, people come into our society, annexation, or the acquiring of slaves. These are ways that we bring personnel into our society. Teaching the new recruits. We have to teach them, our norms and values in our society. So either through formally, through schools, formally or informally, peer-to-peer. Families will teach these new recruits. Peers will teach these new recruits. The third is producing and distributing goods and services. We must provide for our members, and so producing these goods and services that they need. Housing, clothing, and so forth. The fourth is preserving order. We need to protect and defend them. So again, these also, we have to maintain the stability. This is in order to maintain stability in our society. Providing and maintaining a sense of purpose. These members we want them to remain motivated to stay as part of the group. So patriotism, a sense of pride, help us maintain this sense of purpose. Otherwise, our members are going to leave. So we don't want that to happen. We want to maintain that social stability. So that is the functionalist perspective on social institutions. Now, the conflict perspective on social institutions does not necessarily agree with the functionalist in that the outcome of meeting basic needs is efficient and desired for all members of society. Conflict theorists argue that major institutions help maintain privileges of the most powerful individuals and groups within society. So, for example, public schools are financed mainly by your property taxes. Therefore, those areas with higher incomes will more likely have better equipped schools and better paid teachers due to the fact that those people in that community will pay higher taxes, and so more money is in that system. Conflict theorists argue that social institutions have inherently conservative natures. So it's difficult to change existing social structure. They look to maintain the status quo. Conflict theorists also argue that social institutions operate in very gendered and racist environments, really reflecting the racism and sexism evident in the larger society. Now, from the interactionist perspective, their view is that social institutions affect our everyday behavior. Our social behavior is based on the roles and statuses that we accept. the groups we belong to, and the institutions within which we function. So, for example, the family as a daughter or sister. Those that would be an interactions would be interested in that, sort of those social interactions. If we look at religion, as a church member versus someone who is plays a role within that religious faith. Education as a student versus a teacher, what would the interactions look at in terms of that sort of relationship, those behaviors, the behaviors of the students, the behaviors of the teachers, the behaviors of administrators. And so here we have a nice table summing up 3 different sociological perspectives, what the role of the social institutions are, and what the focus is. The 5th element in the social structure are social networks. So as members of different groups, we make connections with people, and these connections are known as social networks. So we have a series of social relationships that link a person directly to others and then indirectly links them to still more people. And networking can center around any activity. We use networking to find jobs, to share news, for many, to quit smoking, to lose weight. So there's a lot of networking out there, relationships that we can develop. We can go online, through social networks. The social media. Not everyone participates equally in these social networks. Maybe they don't have access to the online versions. But if you look at it in terms of a spider web, you can have one relationship with one person, but then indirectly know who their other friends might be or other family members might be. And it can center in all these different activities. Quitting smoking. A cluster analysis is often what people do in order, and that actually is something being used, the contact networking of people in terms of how we, a virus such as the one, where the pandemic going on, who we've been connected to, making those social contacts with. It can become around a political issue, or so political action groups, getting the word out about a candidate, especially during election time. So political action groups would be a good example of social networks. Special needs groups, networking through those special needs groups to find out what resources are out there. PACT is one of the ones I'm aware of in terms of autism, because I have 2 children who are on the autism spectrum. So you become involved in different groups based on some of your interests as well. It comes from there's a classic study in Milgram did with if you send a letter to someone, how many you have a target for that letter to get to, and you send it to the closest person, how many steps does it take to get to that target. So that was a classic experiment. You might know it, be more familiar with it in terms of Kevin Bacon. How many connections a person might have to Kevin Bacon, and that's really the idea. You mail it to the first person, the letter to the first person and they mail it to another person. Maybe they know in a different state. And it takes 6 times to get to the target. That's when he did the experiment. So it's just the way that networking works. We also have virtual worlds within the social networking, and it can so where our life can migrate, can very much migrate into our real life. Many people, my son included, have made friends through technology, through games, online games that he's played. So he's met people from Maine, all over the United States. Facebook is at MySpace, I think, was one of the original virtual social media type networks, and these are alternative forms. And many people can create an avatar, and there's really complex virtual worlds online socializations can be very, cyberbullying can occur. So these online socializations may often not necessarily reinforce people's prejudices, but people can allow them to think beyond and understand different cultures. But on the other hand, they can also perpetuate them, hiding behind that power, behind that screen. So be very careful online, in that online environment. It helps to preserve real world networks, people who are during wartime when we're deployed at other places, people who live very distant from each other, especially now social distancing. Many of these virtual worlds have helped many people stay connected. People in the hospitals with this COVID-19 not being able to see their family members are using these virtual platforms. Nurses and doctors are going into the patient rooms and helping them to see each other and talk to one another through that medium. So, and even the way we're delivering education right now. So there is definitely a benefit, pros and cons to everything. And here we see just an illustration of these different elements of the social structure. The statuses, ascribed versus achieved, and then the master status, our social roles, and we have the role conflict, role strain, and role exit. So those things you want to remember. Our groups, we're going to go over these more particularly now: primary versus secondary, reference groups, in-groups and out-groups, our social networks, and our social institutions. So we're going to focus on groups in the next modules. But before we get to that, we're going to talk about the global perspective. That we're going to look at the complexity of modern societies, and this is important to look at. And you'll see how we've changed, how societies have changed as they've become modernized and become more complex. 3 sociologists have developed ways to examine these modern societies with earlier, more simpler forms of social structure. So as social structure becomes more complex, you see how our roles change. These sociologists were Emil Durkheim, Ferdinand Tönnies, and Gerhard Lenski. So we're going to talk about Durkheim's description being based on the division of labor in society, and he refers to mechanical and organic solidarity. So we'll go over those terms. Tönnies used the terms Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. He was a German sociologist who, again, kind of similar, in concept to Durkheim's, but, we'll see the slight nuances there. And then Lenski, he took a sociocultural evolution approach, and we'll talk about that next. First, Durkheim. Durkheim wrote about the division of labor in 1893. It was translated to English in 1933. Again, you don't need to memorize these dates, but it was his doctoral dissertation. And so, this is what he spent a lot of work on. And then what he does is writes about the social structure and how it depends on how different tasks are performed in society. So in societies, he says, with very little division of labor, mechanical solidarity exists. So according to Durkheim, mechanical solidarity is a collective consciousness that emphasizes group solidarity in which all individuals perform the same tasks. So in this type of society, each person sees their tasks through from beginning to end. Social interaction is based on close, intimate, face-to-face social contacts. So it's characteristic. This is characteristic of societies with minimal division of labor. So we want to think Little House on the Prairie, or think of families, rural, living in during rural times where every family for survival is seeing things through from beginning to end. They cultivate their land, they plant their crops, they grow their crops, they harvest. So if they're growing, wheat, they're going to, harvest that wheat, turn it into bread and to be able to feed their family. So whatever, the the task is, they're going to see everything through from beginning to end. Groups are the dominating force. Very few social roles. So children are working alongside their parents, and everybody is working together for their survival. So this is mechanical solidarity. As societies become more advanced, there is greater division of labor. Different tasks are performed by different individuals. Individuals start to depend on one another because tasks become more specialized. These social interactions become less personal. People are referred to by their social position. So the baker, the butcher, the shoemaker. So you start to see these individuals in organic solidarity start to really depend on one another. There's greater division of labor, and we become dependent on each other for this group survival. So the farmer who may grow the wheat grows an overabundance of wheat, so now he's able to harvest it and pass that wheat on to the baker, who then can take that wheat, turn it into bread, who then may sell that bread to a merchant who can sell it at market. So again, all these people depend on one another. If the farmer has a bad season crop, it's going to affect all of those people. So this helps us understand the complexity of society today. According to Durkheim, mechanical solidarity gets replaced by the organic solidarity. Then that's defined as that collective consciousness resting on the need a society members have for one another. So you want to think about this term organic. He uses the term organic as the way the organs in the body are interdependent. So if you think of all the organs in the body are dependent on one another, so are people in society dependent on one another. Ferdinand Tönnies expressed his views in the late 1800s in Germany, thus the German terms. Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft are the two terms he used. The Gemeinschaft is that close-knit community that is typical of rural life. Again, Little House on the Prairie, I think. People have similar backgrounds. You want to imagine rural life. Social interactions are intimate and familiar. Everyone knows one another. Little privacy. Everyone knows each other's business. And social control is maintained through informal means. There's a strong sense of community. People are not driven by self-interest, but by the needs of the larger group. And this informal means of sanctions will help reinforce those social norms. People care what others think of them, so it sort of makes them stay on the right track, so to speak. And one generation to the next pretty much stays the same in the Gemeinschaft. Gesellschaft is an ideal type characteristic of modern life. So if you think about ways to remember these terms, Gemein, mine, my close-knit group, mine. Gesell, where you're going out in the community, you're depending on others to sell. So Gesellschaft. That's how I try to think of visuals to help you remember the distinction between these terms. Gesellschaft is an ideal type characteristic of modern life. Most people are strangers and feel little connection, little in common with one another. So think large urban communities where most people are strangers. Relationships are governed by the social roles. Self-interest dominates here. I've got to sell my products because I have to do well, to better myself. Social control is maintained by the formal laws. So social control is through formal means, laws. Little consensus concerning values or commitment to the group. So very much self-interest. And the last thing is social change is usually within a generation. And this table, again, is very detailed, but it pretty much lays out the differences between the Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, some of which I mentioned, the rural type versus urban, privacy versus self-interest versus the group. And so you want to take a look at these if you're doing 3x5 cards. pick out the primary differences, distinctions that will help you remember the difference in the terms. And next we have Lenski's approach, Lenski's sociocultural evolution approach. So Lenski views human societies as undergoing a process of change characterized by a dominant pattern called the sociocultural evolution, where human societies undergo this process of change characterized by a dominant pattern. According to Lenski, technology is critical to the way society is organized. With the advancement of technology, communities evolved from pre-industrial to post-industrial society. Long-term social trends result from the interplay of continuity, innovation, and selection. So society's level of technology is critical to the way it's organized. So if you think about it, we're going to talk a little bit about how, in earlier societies, pre-industrial societies, the technology, not the technology we use on computers, but whatever the material goods, that cultural information about the ways in which the material resources of the time, of the environment, may be used to satisfy our human needs and desires. So whatever materials are available to us in pre-industrial societies is going to dictate how we function. And then as we become more industrialized, think about the telephone. I always use this as an example. If we have the telephone, before we had the telephone, how did we communicate? How did we send messages to each other? Maybe letters. And then as the phone was developed, it sort of changed the way we communicate. So think about as something like that. So as you may recall, Lenski defines that as technology as that cultural information about the ways in which the material resources of the environment may be used to satisfy our human needs and desires. So what are those material resources during the pre-industrial, the industrial, and post-industrial societies? That's what we're going to think about next. Okay, first, in pre-industrial societies, Lenski describes 3 types. This is the first type, the hunting and gathering society. Think about the beginning of human life. This is where people rely on whatever foods and fibers are readily available. Technology is minimal. People are in constant move and search for food. They're usually in small groups related to one another. So kinship ties are strong and the source of authority. People are looking out for their survival, so they're tending to be in small groups. The second type are the horticultural societies. This is where people get tired of moving around looking for food. They're like, hey, let's plant some seeds. So they start to plant seeds and crops rather than merely subsist on what's available. So people are planting seeds rather than surviving on the available foods. This is about we're talking 12,000 years ago. So they become less nomadic, which means they begin to settle down. Technology is still limited. So they're producing, tools and household goods. So the greater emphasis on the production of tools and household objects in their settlement. The third type are agrarian societies, and this is where people are primarily engaged in the production of food. This is now we're talking 5,000 years ago. There's an increase in crops and innovations like the plow. Technological innovations like the plow can increase what your crop yields. So settlements are becoming larger. We're seeing the emergence of larger settlements. Social structure has more defined roles. We're starting to see some more specialized tasks. Next, we have industrial society. So as the Industrial Revolution took place from around 1760 to the mid-1800s. So during this time, societies start to depend on machine power to produce its goods and services. New inventions and new energy sources help with agriculture and industrial production. There becomes this need for specialized knowledge. So education becomes a social institution outside of the family. People need to go outside of the family to learn these new innovations, these new tasks. The family is no longer a self-sufficient unit. Workers leave home to work in central cities or central locations like factories. And so this is the time of the Industrial Revolution. So it really changes the way society is structured. Next, we see post-industrial and post-modern societies. A post-industrial society is technologically advanced, and its economic system is primarily engaged in processing and controlling information. Now we're now all the way jumped up to the 1960s. So the main output is services rather than manufactured goods. We see that shift away from manufacturing into the service industry. There's a decline in the organized working class groups. So change from manufacturing to a service economy. We see the expansion of the middle class. Types of jobs at this time we're seeing advertising, public relations, human resources, computer information systems. Okay, so these become very service oriented instead of actually producing and manufacturing goods. Postmodern societies are technologically sophisticated and are preoccupied with consumer goods and media images. This is starting in the latter part of the 1970s. Online social networking, a cross-cultural integration becomes very prominent. Consumption of goods and information on a large scale, global perspective. So we're seeing here again more postmodern society in our current times. So here is the stages in this Lenski socio-cultural evolution. So you see the different societal approaches, the different time periods. As I mentioned, the dates. Again, you don't have to memorize these, but think about the times and how times have changed, and what is characteristics of these different societal types. Now, as I mentioned, this element, the fifth element, the third element in the social structure is groups. So this third element of social structure, where social interactions are primarily occur. Sociologists define groups as any number of people with similar norms, values, and expectations who interact on a regular basis. I just took the definition from our previous slide. But we're going to talk about and distinguish the groups in 5 ways. We're going to talk about primary groups, secondary groups, in-groups and out-groups, and reference groups. These groups play a vital part in our social structure. Social interaction takes place within groups and is influenced by their norms and their sanctions. We're either going to, by the norms, if we follow the norms, we have positive sanctions. If we don't, negative sanctions. Expectations associated with many social roles are clearly defined in the context of a group, and group solidarity can influence recovery from any kind of traumatic event. You have the support of your family, your friends, the community, the small community within which you live. So again, let's try to understand groups a little bit better now. Charles Horton Cooley coined the term primary group to refer to a small group with intimate face-to-face closeness and cooperation involved in day-to-day existence. These would be your, examples are your family members, but it could also be, a street gang, fraternity, sorority, your peer group. Anybody you engage with on a daily, everyday, intimate level. The pivotal role in socialization and development of role and statuses take place within this primary group. Sort of like your, think back on your primary agent of socialization, the family. On the other hand, we have secondary groups, and this is a little bit larger, formal, impersonal group with little social intimacy or mutual understanding. Examples include people you work with. If you were face-to-face in the classroom, your classmates. They're a secondary group, as opposed, maybe you have friendships or primary groups within that secondary group, and they can develop out of a larger, secondary group. But you wouldn't share your most personal, intimate details of your life with someone in a secondary group, unless, of course, you're close friends. So again, here's the differences. Generally small, or primary groups are generally small. Secondary groups are usually large. Primary groups are more intimate, face-to-face. There's little intimacy in the secondary group, but there's some mutual understanding because you're sharing whatever class you're going to. Think about it that way. Primary groups are very cooperative and friendly, and secondary groups are a little bit more formal and impersonal. Now, William G. Sumner defined in-groups and out-groups. An in-group is any group or category to which people feel they belong, whereas the out-group is any group or category to which people feel they do not belong. There is a certain feeling of superiority that comes from being in the in-group. The in-group virtues versus the out-group vices. We are, in what we do is the right way. Those people on the out are not. There's something negative to the out-group. It's a double standard where acceptable behavior among in-group members is deemed unacceptable by people in the out-group. So, conflict can arise with these groups, and that's what's important to kind of understand here. As simple as these definitions are, understanding conflict between in-groups and out-groups can turn very violent, both on a personal level, but also on a larger scale level, even in politics. So one example that really stands out the most, and maybe you recall, or maybe you've heard or read the story of Columbine High School. And the reason that, it was a tragic, horrific incident in 1999 where two boys targeted those who were members of the in-group. This is how it can turn violent. They felt like they were treated as the out-group, and they were treated differently. And so and this is discovered because this was written in some materials in the investigation that came out afterwards, after the horrific ending to this tragedy. So bullying can occur, even not as extreme as what happened in Columbine, but even bullying can occur between groups. So people who belong, they feel superior because they belong. They're within the in-group, and they can be really ostracizing to those who don't belong. Next, we have reference groups, and we use reference groups as sort of a standard for evaluating our own behavior. So these are groups that individuals use as a standard for evaluating themselves and their own behavior. We set and enforce standards of conduct and belief, and it helps with the anticipatory socialization, which we talked about in the earlier chapter. So say I was interested in becoming an athlete. My reference group would be the particular sport I was interested in. And I would model my behavior, learn everything I can about the sport, maybe even dress the way I see some of the athletes do, or something like that. Or maybe you're, as a college student, you want to become, a doctor or a medical professional. You begin to observe and interact with other students who are attending medical school, who may be a little bit further along, and you find out, well, what classes do you take? And you kind of model your behavior after those people in that group. So they serve as a normative function by setting and enforcing standards of conduct and belief, and performs a comparison function by serving as that standard which we can measure ourselves against. Another example is our coalitions in groups, and these may develop as groups start to grow large. And these can be temporary or permanent alliances geared towards a common goal. So they can be very broad-based, or they can be very narrow, specific. And they can be intentionally short-lived, as in this program, this reality program, Survivor. They kind of develop these coalitions in order to survive to the end, developing these alliances. But, political coalitions exist, religious Christian coalitions, again, around a particular goal, grassroots organizations, Save the Whales and things like that, kind of get behind a particular idea and goal. All right, this next module is where we kind of see groups get so large that we need to understand them in terms of formal organizations and bureaucracies. So we're going to cover what a characteristics of a bureaucracy is, and then look at it as an organizational culture. Because many of us, as we move forward, you're going to operate with it. In school, you're operating within an organization and a bureaucracy. As you move into in the work world, ultimately we're going to be in contact with these different bureaucratic organizations. So as societies have evolved, social relationships and social structure has become more complex and requiring more advanced forms of organization. And these are large secondary groups known as formal organizations, designed for a special purpose and structured for maximum efficiency. In the U.S., formal organizations fulfill a variety of personal and societal needs. So some examples include the U.S. Postal Service, the Department of Motor Vehicles, Starbucks, where you get your favorite coffee, maybe Wawa, McDonald's, healthcare system, churches, the Boston Pops. So we have various examples of formal organizations. They vary in size, specificity of goals, and degree of efficiency, but all are structured to facilitate large-scale operations. In our society, formal organizations fulfill enormous variety of personal and societal needs, and our ascribed status often influences how we see ourselves within these formal organizations. So in other words, our gender, our race and ethnicity will influence how we see ourselves in that organization, whether or not there's a strong presence of women and or persons of color in positions of power and authority within the organization that we belong. It actually can influence our self-image and our behavior there. Characteristics of a bureaucracy. Now, a bureaucracy is a component of formal organization that uses rules and hierarchical ranking to achieve efficiency. In an industrial society such as our own, almost all occupations have elements of a bureaucracy. And there's sort of that expression, cutting through the bureaucratic red tape. Max Weber was the first to emphasize the similarity in structure and process found in differing institutions such as religion, government, education, and business. And Weber developed an ideal type bureaucracy. If you remember, he was our theorist that defined what ideal type. So this was a model for evaluating the most basic characteristics of an organization. So this is a construct. Perfect bureaucracies do not exist. He emphasized similarities among these different social institutions, and he proposed 5 basic characteristics of the ideal bureaucracy. So we're going to cover what these 5 basic characteristics are. The first is the division of labor, where workers become specialized and perform specific tasks. The specialization of tasks ultimately removes the connection a worker will have to the overall objective of the bureaucracy. Now, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in the Communist Manifesto wrote that this results in alienation among workers, causing them to become disassociated from the surrounding society. And something referred to as trained incapacity occurs when workers become so specialized that they develop blind spots and fail to notice obvious problems. And so many examples of this might appear in the terms of, when you hear of a product recall, something got pushed through the production line with a defect in it because of, the need for that person in the factory to kind of reach a level of production. They need to make, 100 widgets a day, and so they might push some things through that don't necessarily meet the security standards. Something along those lines would become so specialized, you're not seeing the end product. You're just working on the task that you have at hand. And so a defect can occur and it gets pushed through. Or, even in, a really, a company that's producing, environmental waste, throwing it out to the into the environment without really, noticing the obvious problems that can result in. It can affect wildlife and the environment if you're, putting out waste into an area that can ultimately leak into the water system. So that's what they're talking about in terms of trained incapacity. Next, we have the hierarchy of authority. And this is where each person is under the supervision of a higher authority. Tasks are delegated down and work is then produced up. So think about a hospital CEO. That's the highest level, but under them is, maybe a president, vice president of a company, managers, and then the workers. College presidents. You have, in a college, you have teachers who report to a department head, who then report to, maybe the dean, who then reports to the college president. Even in religion, there's a hierarchy of authority. You've got, priests who then report to bishop and cardinal and whatever, there's different levels of authority that reaches up ultimately to a pope in religion. The next is written rules and regulations, where employees know what is expected of their performance. The rules and regulations ensure uniform performance of every task and offer continuity. So these written rules and regulations offer employees clear standards for an adequate performance. Usually a job description is out there that what is expected in your occupation. They provide this valuable sense of continuity. If one person leaves and another person steps in to that role, they know exactly what to do. Another example of this is a teacher who needs to follow a certain curriculum to know what they're teaching at a specific grade level. Another example I like to illustrate is, Starbucks. You work at a Starbucks. There's a certain way in which you make a venti caramel macchiato, and so the person in that job has written, rules understanding what their job role is and how to make the product. Goal displacement is a term used by Robert Merton to describe when rules and regulations overshadow larger goals of the organization and where it becomes dysfunctional. This example of this can occur when, for example, when an emergency room doctor may refuse to treat a patient because there's no ability to pay or proof of a person's citizenship. Now, you can't turn away a person because of their inability to pay from an ER. They have to be treated. But this is overzealous conformity to those regulations. Same thing with in a cafeteria, the cafeteria lunch lady. She can't refuse a student's lunch because they have no money in their lunch account. The school must feed the children and then send a note home to mom or dad and say, hey, you need to put money into their lunch account. In an example where this actually happened, the lunch cafeteria lady actually went up to was told by her manager to take the lunch away from a child that was already given the lunch. And so not only did it create, poor embarrassment for the young child, but the cafeteria lady went public with this and actually quit her job over this. Another example of goal displacement is where an organization meets the goal of the organization, like the March of Dimes. Initially, they were battling a condition called polio, and once that was abolished through vaccine, they didn't just say, okay, we did what we had to do and let's move on. Everyone go home. No, they kept the organization going, and so they found, let's start battling other sorts of birth defects. And so it sort of gives you this new goal to go after in the organization, to keep a viable organization functioning. Okay, next we have impersonality. Impersonality refers to when Workers perform their duties without getting personally connected. It is intended to provide equal treatment to all. Bureaucratic norms dictate that officials perform duties without personal consideration to people as individuals. And the best example I could think of is this: when I was observing a trauma intensive care unit back at when I was in graduate school, and I interviewed the chief of trauma and the attending trauma physician. And, the doctors do not get personally involved with the patients or their family members. And, they have a task at hand and they remain impersonal in order to get their job done. So a doctor not getting to know the patients personally in the ICU or the trauma situation, they become desensitized, and they say they have to, otherwise they'd be just an emotional wreck every time they got too personally connected. So the patients become the condition in which they've entered into the hospital with. So again, imagine all of these doctors and nurses right now dealing with the pandemic. It's so hard to desensitize yourself. You've got people, families separated, very, very ill, sick patients. And it's very, very hard to kind of maintain that sense of impersonality when you are, faced with that on a constant basis under the circumstances, which is why, it's so important to wear our masks. So again, if you look at this illustration here of employees working in these cubicles, many people become, isolated and impersonal in terms of even their work environment. So personalizing their cubicle helps to work within a bureaucracy. And then number 5 is the employment based on technical qualifications. Hiring is based on technical qualifications, and performance is measured against specific standards. Ideally, we would like to see that people get hired and promoted based on their ability to do their job. Now, Lawrence J. Peter hypothesized that every employee within a hierarchy tends to rise to his or her level of incompetence. This is known as the Peter principle. So we keep getting promoted until you can't handle the position. So you would keep rising in that hierarchy. In other words, you work your way up the ladder, and so you take classes and skills until you've reached the level where you're not able to take on that position. Now, bureaucracy pervades our modern life. Truly, we are a McDonaldized society. McDonaldization is the process by which the principles of the fast food restaurant, the fast food industry, are coming to dominate more and more sectors of American society, as well as the rest of the world. And this is according to George Ritzer. McDonald's, in fact, does also have the 5 characteristics of a bureaucracy we just talked about. But when you think about how fast-paced of a society we live in, we want things now, we want things quick. Banking, our medical care, we don't have time to be sick. We need to go to the minute clinic or go through the drive-through to get our food. And so we're definitely seeing how this is pervading our everyday life. So here we have a table illustrating the different components and characteristics of a bureaucracy, the 5 characteristics, what the positive consequence to these things are, the negative consequence to the individual, and the negative consequences as an organization. Characteristics of a bureaucracy, again, bureaucratization, and just a couple more terms, and the iron law of oligarchy. Bureaucratization is a process, and it's a process by which groups, organizations, or social movements become increasingly bureaucratic. And it happens within small groups as well as large organizations. So even in your small book group or your book club, even into the large organizations, this can happen. we tend to look to a leader, and we tend to find, that it needs to be able to sort of run the group or run the organizations. According to German sociologist Robert Michels, even a democratic organization eventually develops into a bureaucracy ruled by a few. That's known as an iron law of oligarchy. So according to Michels, we have the tendency to look to leaders for direction, reinforcing oligarchy, the rule by a few. Certain people tend to rise to the top based on their skill, based on their knowledge, based on their appeal, their charisma. People who achieve those leadership roles have the skills, knowledge, and charisma and appeal to direct or control others. Sociologists are interested in how bureaucracies affect the individual who work within them. The first approach is the classical theory or scientific management approach, in which workers are motivated almost entirely by economic rewards and are treated like a resource. This is where we see formations of unions that help change this view. Workers we work for a monetary reward, and employers are looking for profit. So that is this scientific management approach. Only the physical constraints on workers limit their productivity. Many people are looked on as, in this case, as a FTE or a full-time equivalent. So when it comes time to downsizing or cutting back and just to cut costs in a job, if you have to cut a person, you're not cutting Jane Smith, who has a single mom of 2 kids. You're not thinking about that. You're thinking about the FTE. And so that's what enables, the impersonality of a large organization to downsize. They're not, getting personally involved. But the unions are helping to change this view, and the human relations approach is what we're kind of trying to move towards. In the human relations approach, this is where the role of people, communication, and their participation within the bureaucracy are emphasized. So this planning focuses on the workers, their feelings, their frustrations, and emotional need for job satisfaction. So many people are asking, how do you feel about their job? I get surveys like that all the time, and what can the administrators help better improve, our teachers' resources, and for us to better perform. So there's a movement away from workers being treated like machines and reflecting the concerns and needs of the workers. So stressing that their feelings, their frustrations. Employee assistance programs is a good example of this, where people are helping. The bureaucracy's other face is a term coined by Charles Page to refer to the unofficial activities and interactions that are a basic part of our daily organizational life. Organizations that form, baseball teams that play after work, and meet up for different activities outside of the work to kind of maintain and give that sort of sense of belonging and sense of identity.